At the end of the previous season, Murphy, Javier, and the police finally managed to track down and kill Pablo Escobar, ending him and his entire cartel for good. However, the drug trade in Colombia did not stop, as the Cali cartel, led by the Rodriguez Orihuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, along with Pacho Herrera and Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, known as Chepe, emerged. They also had an alliance with Fidel and Carlos from the Los Pepes group. These leaders decided to take control of the entire cocaine trade in Colombia. Due to this escalation, Javier Peña was summoned back to Colombia, and this time his mission was to take down the Cali cartel entirely. The new season starts with Javier in the United States, attending a family wedding. At the end of the wedding, while driving back with his father asks him about his plans for Colombia. Javier responds that he is determined to return to Colombia and chase down the Cali cartel just like he did with Pablo Escobar. Although his father is not in favor of this and wishes for him to have a peaceful life, he still wishes him success. The next day, Javier boards the first flight to Colombia. Shortly after, he arrives at the United States Embassy in Bogotá. Upon arrival, he meets a young man named Stiedler, who informs him that he will be his new assistant. However, Javier doesn't seem to care much and heads straight to meet Ambassador Arthur. Javier asks the ambassador about Murphy, and Arthur tells him that Murphy finished his mission by taking down Pablo Escobar and returned to the United States to settle down with his family. Arthur then tells Javier that the embassy will support him in every possible way to take down the Cali cartel and that he will have full cooperation. He also informs him that Agent Bill, who had previously hindered his work due to his connections with the Cali cartel, will now fully assist him. Javier feels reassured and becomes more motivated for his new mission. Next, we move to the Cali cartel, where the leadership is divided between 4 people: Pacho Herrera, who is responsible for distribution and is the least powerful of them; Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, Chepe, who lives in New York and manages the cartel's operations from there; Miguel Rodriguez, who handles finances and supervises the bribes given to officers and politicians; and finally, Gilberto Rodriguez, who is the overall leader of the cartel. In a large meeting at Gilberto's mansion, he gathers all his men, including Chepe, who flew in from New York. It's the first time they've all gathered in one place. The purpose of this gathering is that Gilberto wants to announce something very important. Now, we move to Jorge Salcedo, the head of security for Gilberto, who works alongside his colleague Cordova. Jorge talks to Cordova about his desire to leave the cartel and start his own private security firm, following the request of his wife Paula, who wants him to get out of the criminal life. At the same time, Javier is working on several cases related to the Cali cartel. He discovers that recently, there was an attack on one of the cartel's warehouses in Miami, and a man named Lucho, who works for the cartel, was arrested. Javier decides to use this case as leverage against Lucho's brother, Andreas, and asks him to cooperate with them. Andreas is tasked with entering Gilberto's party as a waiter and recording everything that happens using a hidden camera and microphone. If he agrees, his brother Lucho will be released. During the party, Andreas starts recording everything. But before Gilberto gives his speech, Jorge intervenes and discovers what Andreas is doing. Instead of exposing him, Jorge removes the camera and microphones and warns Andreas that he must leave the city entirely or the cartel will hunt him down. Andreas agrees in fear and leaves. Later, Gilberto finally gives his speech and tells his men that he has reached an agreement with the Colombian authorities to stop the drug trade completely within 6 months. In return, they will be allowed to keep the money they have earned from the drug trade, enabling them to start legal businesses and make substantial profits. Gilberto emphasizes the need to make as much money as possible during these 6 months before completely stopping illegal activities. His speech comes as a shock to some of his men, but no one dares to object. After the speech, Miguel Rodriguez goes to speak with Maria, Claudio's wife, and it becomes clear that he is interested in her. Later, Miguel informs Jorge that he cannot quit the job until the 6 months have passed and the cartel stops its operations, leaving Jorge feeling confused and shocked. At the same time, Javier sits in a bar where Bill, the United States Embassy agent, approaches him. Bill tells Javier bluntly that the cartel has reached an agreement with the government and that there is no need to chase them anymore because they will stop drug trafficking in 6 months. Javier is outraged and feels betrayed, realizing that his mission was just a cover while negotiations were happening behind the scenes. Bill leaves Javier in shock and frustration. Elsewhere, we see Duffy and Lopez, who were part of Javier's team, receiving a clear warning when they find a video showing them trying to recruit Andreas. It turns out that the Cali cartel had been monitoring their every move. We also learn that the cartel controls all telecommunications, airports, and even the police in Cali, allowing them to spy on anyone and track their movements. In the final scenes, Miguel decides to eliminate Claudio, not only because of old disputes but also due to his interest in Maria. The crime is carried out in a brutal manner when Claudio is tied to 2 motorcycles and pulled until his limbs are torn from his body, leading to his gruesome death. At the same time, we see Gilberto's men eliminating everyone opposing his decision to end the drug trade. This way, Gilberto gets rid of all his enemies within the cartel. The next day, a group of Gilberto's men, led by David, Miguel's son, are seen with pipes filled with toxic gas. They were supposed to dispose of the gas in the pipes to fill them with cocaine and ship it to the United States, as the pipes are not inspected at the airport. However, David and his men didn't realize that the gas they removed from the pipes was leaking into nearby homes, causing a disaster. The next day, we see Gilberto sitting with Henao, who is Claudio's boss. Henao is furious about the way Pacho killed Claudio in front of people, considering it a great insult. Gilberto tries to calm Henao and promises him a large financial compensation. Henao agrees and leaves. Afterward, Gilberto speaks with Pacho and asks him to go to Mexico to run their operations there for the next 6 months to avoid local problems. Pacho reluctantly agrees. Meanwhile, Gilberto receives bad news about the gas leak incident. He fears that people might discover the cartel's involvement in the disaster, so he gathers his men, including David, and scolds them for the massive mistake. He orders them to contact Jorge to fix the problem. At the scene, a journalist named Carolina discovers that the police have found one of the pipes causing the leak, which belongs to a fake company owned by the Cali cartel, making her realize the cartel's involvement. At the American embassy, Javier meets with Ambassador Arthur and some of Cali's police chiefs. They present photos of Duffy and Lopez with Andreas, showing that the cartel had been monitoring them. The police chiefs ask the embassy to withdraw their agents from Cali, and Arthur and Javier reluctantly agree. Later, Javier informs Duffy and Lopez that their mission in Colombia is over and they must return to the United States. They agree but feel disappointed. Later, a new officer named Chris arrives to replace Duffy and Lopez. Chris asks Javier to go to Cali to track down the cartel, but Javier refuses, feeling frustrated by the lack of progress. While stepping out for a cigarette, the journalist Carolina approaches Javier and tells him that the gas leak was caused by Gilberto and his cartel, but they will get away with it as usual, even though many children died because of the incident. Javier is shocked but doesn't respond and leaves. Elsewhere, we see Jorge with his parents and wife inspecting a piece of land he bought to build a house nearby. Later, Jorge meets Cordova and tells him they need to find a way to pressure the safety inspector overseeing the area affected by the gas leak, forcing him to blame the gas company instead of the cartel. Jorge agrees and begins searching for something to use against the inspector. After some investigation, Jorge discovers that the inspector's wife is cheating on him with another man at a hotel. Jorge goes to the hotel and takes pictures of her with her lover. He returns with the photos to Gilberto, who decides to send Cordova to blackmail the inspector, but David insists that Gilberto send Jorge instead. Jorge prefers to avoid such tasks, but he reluctantly agrees and goes to meet the inspector to blackmail him. In the end, the inspector announces on television that the gas leak was due to a problem with the gas company supplying the area, not the cartel. Javier watches the press conference and becomes furious, deciding to act against the Cali cartel without Bill or intelligence's knowledge. He goes to Officer Chris and asks him to prepare to head to Cali to monitor the cartel. In New York, we see Chepe contacting Gilberto, telling him that he's facing some problems and wants to lay low for a while. Gilberto reassures him that everything will be fine, but Chepe informs him that he needs to resolve an issue related to securing a critical chemical for making cocaine. Chepe goes to the factory that supplies them with the chemical, but the factory manager tells him that another Dominican gang has seized the chemical by force. Chepe gets angry and demands the gang's location, then he and his men go to eliminate them. A few days later, Pacho and his younger brother Alvaro arrive in Mexico, where they are met by a man named Carrillo, who is in charge of managing the cartel's operations there. Pacho came to negotiate a deal with Carrillo regarding their last transaction before they cease operations. Carrillo takes Pacho to his home and tries to convince him not to quit the drug trade, even if Gilberto decides to stop. Pacho stays in Mexico for a few days to make his decision. Meanwhile, Javier attends a meeting with Ambassador Arthur and 2 United States congressmen. The congressmen have come to assess Javier's efforts in fighting drug traffickers, and based on their findings, the United States will decide how much financial support to give Colombia. We also learn that the Cali cartel is always transferring its money from the United States to Panama, where a man named Franklin launders the money. Javier doesn't know who Franklin is, but he starts gathering information about him by threatening local companies in Colombia with cutting off United States business ties if they don't cooperate. Eventually, Javier uncovers Franklin's identity and begins monitoring him. Franklin lives in a remote area with his American wife, who is addicted to cocaine. Franklin tells his wife that he has to go to handle some business and leaves. Javier decides to monitor both Franklin and his wife to catch him. Later, Javier follows Franklin to the airport and discovers that he has bought a ticket to Panama. Javier decides to travel to Panama as well on an embassy plane. But when he gets to the airport, he finds Bill there. Bill tells him that he's not going anywhere and that he has to accompany the congressman on a trip to a specific site. In the end, Bill takes Javier and the congressman to a jungle on the Colombian border, where they are met by a military commander named Miles. There, Bill shows them the bodies of Colombian smugglers to convince the congressman of the need for United States intelligence funding to fight the traffickers. But Javier realizes that the bodies are not of smugglers but ordinary people killed to convince the congressman. Bill continues to persuade the congressman of the need for United States forces in Colombia and controlling the border, not just to fight traffickers but also to prevent the spread of communism in the region. After the meeting, Javier talks to Bill and tells him that he knows his plan is to make the Cali cartel surrender without a fight so the United States government can focus on fighting the communists. Bill responds that this is the greatest threat to America. But Javier insists on continuing his war against the cartel, even if he has to do it alone. In Cali, Chris and another officer named Dan arrive. Their mission is to monitor companies linked to the cartel and prove they are fake businesses laundering cartel money. There, they meet a corrupt Colombian officer named Calderon, who claims to hate the Cali cartel and offers to help them take it down. At this time, Calderon takes them on a tour of the companies they came to inspect. Elsewhere, we see Jorge welcoming an American lawyer named Starkman and taking him to meet with Gilberto, Miguel, and their accountant, Palomari. We learn that Starkman came to finalize a significant deal with Gilberto and Miguel, so much so that Palomari leaves to prepare the paperwork and organize the money. The problem now is that Dan, Chris, and Calderon arrive at the building where Palomari's office is located and decide to inspect it. Calderon is shocked, as he wasn't prepared for this and cannot warn the cartel since he is playing a double role, as I mentioned earlier. After much thought, Calderon decides to accompany them during the inspection to maintain their trust. One of Jorge's men sees what is happening and informs him. Jorge panics and immediately calls Palomari, warning him to hide any money or incriminating documents before the police arrive. However, Palomari doesn't care and hangs up on him. Jorge drives recklessly, speeding to Palomari's office to get there before the police. When he arrives, he finds the police about to enter, so he rushes into the office and hides the money and any incriminating documents. Then, he hides in the office. The police enter with Dan, Chris, and Calderon, but they find no money, only some papers and files, which they take and leave. After this, they all head to the station where Calderon works, and they inform him that they want to take the files to the embassy for review, but Calderon refuses. At this point, they realize that Calderon is a traitor working with the cartel, but they don't act on this for the time being and leave. Jorge then goes to meet Cordova and tells him what happened, asking him to ensure that Palomari listens to him in the future. Jorge leaves, angry, and goes to meet with potential investors interested in investing in his security company, which he plans to launch after leaving the cartel. While sitting with the investors and his wife, Paula, David, Miguel's son, arrives and enters the restaurant. When David sees Jorge, he walks toward him and greets him in a way that suggests they are working together. The investors notice this and decide not to invest in his company, infuriating Jorge. It's unclear what he intends to do about David after this incident. We return to Dan and Chris, who head back to the embassy in another city, not Cali. While at the airport, Dan realizes something important. Palomari is from Chile, and since there is an extradition agreement between Chile and the United States, they can arrest and extradite him to the United States. The two decide to return to Palomari's office and arrest him, then get him to testify against Gilberto and the cartel. They follow Palomari and watch him meet with Cordova and get into a car with him. They tail them to a certain house and wait outside. After a while, they exit, and the two plan to arrest Palomari, but they are surprised when Gilberto appears. They immediately call Javier and inform him that they've found Gilberto, who is hiding in this house until he finalizes a deal with the government. Upon hearing this, Javier meets with Officer Martinez and tells him that they can now track down and arrest Gilberto. Martinez is shocked, and it's unclear what he will do next. Elsewhere, Maria meets with Miguel and tells him that she wants her son, who is being kept by Claudio's mother, and in return, she might agree to marry him. Miguel agrees and allows her to stay in a private apartment until he can retrieve her son. The next day, Miguel contacts Jorge and asks him to go with Navagente to retrieve the child from Claudio's mother. Jorge agrees, and he and Navagente head to Claudio's mother's house. Jorge speaks with her, asking her to hand over the child without any trouble, but she refuses, saying that Maria took advantage of her son's death. At this point, Claudio's brothers show up and hold Jorge captive, planning to kill him. However, Navagente intervenes just in time, restraining the mother and her sons and forcing them to hand over the child. They take the child and leave without being harmed. Meanwhile, we see Martinez and his men preparing to head to Gilberto's hideout, hiding inside a large truck loaded with chickens to avoid detection by corrupt Cali police. During this time, we see Javier, Chris, and Dan with Calderon, tricking him into thinking they are going to raid a certain house to keep him distracted and prevent him from interfering with their plan. After raiding the fake house, they find nothing, and Calderon decides to return to the station. But Javier leads him to Gilberto's house by giving him certain directions until Calderon finds himself in front of the house where Gilberto is hiding. Calderon is shocked and realizes the truth. Martinez arrives at the house and explains to Calderon that they had to bring him along so he wouldn't interfere, and they place him under the guard of a soldier. Martinez, Javier, Chris, and Dan enter the house and search it until Javier finds a secret room where Gilberto is hiding. They arrest him, but Calderon manages to escape after tricking the soldier guarding him. Calderon calls the corrupt police and asks them to send a large force to pursue Javier and his team. The corrupt police begin chasing them, but Javier and his team manage to escape and reach the airport, where they take Gilberto with them and leave Cali. Later, the new president of Colombia, Ernesto, meets with his leaders, Javier, Bill, and some United States officials to discuss what should be done with Gilberto. Some leaders suggest releasing him and completing the deal, but Ernesto refuses and decides to imprison him. As Javier leaves the meeting, he finds a small note saying, "You ruined everything. Face the consequences." Javier knows that Bill left him this message, but he doesn't care much. Javier returns to his work, where he meets Martinez, who tells him that he will have to leave the police because one of the corrupt leaders accused him of bribery due to his involvement in Gilberto's arrest. Javier is shocked and apologizes to Martinez, but Martinez asks him to keep pursuing the cartel no matter what happens. Meanwhile, we see Miguel meeting with his men, including Jorge, and asking them to tighten security in the coming period until things calm down. Miguel contacts Pacho and Chepe, asking them to stay in their locations and not return to the United States until the situation stabilizes. As for Gilberto, we see him in prison, where he is visited by his son, Nicholas, who will be handling his defense. Gilberto seems to be in denial, believing he will be released soon, but Nicholas tries to convince him that he needs to prepare for trial. At the same time, Javier attends a meeting with police leaders and the Minister of the Interior, who blames him for getting involved in all this trouble and asks him to quickly work on arresting the remaining cartel leaders, or else they will face a wave of violence like the one that happened during Pablo Escobar's time. Javier feels cornered but promises the minister that he will be able to arrest the remaining leaders soon. Later, Javier holds a meeting with the Minister of Defense, who tells him that they need to find a witness to testify against Gilberto so they can sentence him to a long-term prison sentence. Javier responds that he's working on it and will bring a witness soon. Shortly after these events, we see Javier and his assistant monitoring a phone call from Cristina, who is Franklin's wife, the man responsible for laundering the cartel's money. Javier was anxiously waiting to find Franklin's location, but unfortunately, he couldn't pinpoint it. Therefore, Javier decides to go to a cafe where Cristina is sitting, and he introduces himself as an American officer, asking to speak with her for a moment. Cristina refuses and leaves. Javier doesn't give up and follows her to her home, asking her to listen to him for just a few minutes. Finally, Cristina agrees to talk to Javier. During their conversation, Javier tells her that she needs to convince her husband, Franklin, to turn himself in and disclose everything he knows about Gilberto. In return, their charges would be reduced since Cristina herself was involved in some of the money laundering activities her husband was conducting. Cristina feels anxious but agrees to think it over and tells Javier that she will talk to Franklin. Later, Javier listens to another phone call between Cristina and her husband, Franklin. Cristina tries to convince Franklin to turn himself in, but he refuses. What catches Javier's attention in this call is not Franklin's refusal but the language he was speaking, allowing Javier to identify the country Franklin was in, a Caribbean island. With this discovery, Javier is able to pinpoint Franklin's location and decides to go after him to make an arrest. The next day, we see Javier at the airport, speaking to Cristina on the phone. She tells him that she will try once more with Franklin and asks him to wait a little longer. Javier agrees to give her some time, but at the same time, he prepares to board a plane to the location where Franklin is residing. We will see in the upcoming events whether Javier succeeds in capturing Franklin or not. Meanwhile, we see Gilberto calling his brother Miguel from prison. Gilberto asks Miguel to invite Henao to a meeting and inform him that everything is going smoothly and that Gilberto's arrest will not affect the business operations. Gilberto knows that Henao is very angry about the current situation and may take the opportunity to cause trouble, so he wants to calm him down. Miguel agrees with what Gilberto said and informs him that he suspects there is a traitor among them, the person who informed the government of Gilberto's hideout. Gilberto asks Miguel to investigate and find out the traitor's identity. Miguel agrees and ends the call with his brother. After that, we see Miguel hosting Henao at his home. By chance, Henao spots Maria and her son in Miguel's house, which enrages him, but he doesn't do anything and leaves. We don't yet know what Henao is planning. Meanwhile, Gilberto meets with his lawyer and his son, Nicholas, and they attempt to contact Mr. Medina, but they are unable to reach him. Mr. Medina is an important government official and the one who negotiated Gilberto's surrender in exchange for keeping his legal assets. Nicholas suggests that he go meet with Medina himself to reach an agreement, but Gilberto refuses, not wanting Nicholas to get further involved with cartel matters. Nonetheless, Nicholas goes to meet with Medina alone and manages to renegotiate with him. Later, Nicholas visits his father in prison and informs him that he has reached a new agreement with Medina. The deal stipulates that Gilberto, Chepe, Miguel, and Pacho will be imprisoned for only 3 years, while the state will confiscate all their illegal assets. However, their legal assets and money will remain theirs. Although Gilberto dislikes the idea of prison, he reluctantly agrees to the deal. At the same time, we see Miguel meeting with Jorge and Cordova, telling them he suspects there is a traitor among them who informed the authorities of Gilberto's location. He asks them to start searching for the traitor. Jorge and Cordova begin investigating. They go to the communications center and listen in on the calls made the day Gilberto was arrested, but they find nothing revealing the informant's identity. Next, they interrogate Calderon, but he denies being the informant. He explains that Dan and Chris found Gilberto's location by following Palomari when he visited Gilberto at his home. At this moment, Cordova becomes anxious because he was with Palomari that day, and he fears being suspected. After some thought, Cordova decides to pin the blame on Calderon and tells Jorge that he will inform everyone that Calderon is the traitor. Jorge agrees to this solution, and it seems like everything is under control. However, later that same day, Jorge receives a call from David, who asks him to come immediately to Miguel's house. When he arrives, David greets him and tells him that Miguel wants to see him. David reveals to Jorge that they've discovered Calderon as a traitor and have decided to kill him. Indeed, David takes Jorge to a room where Calderon is being held and tortured, then David and his men kill him in a shocking scene. But the biggest surprise comes when David takes Jorge to another room, where he finds Cordova being held and tortured. David tells him that Cordova tried to flee the city with his family, which made him suspicious that Cordova was the informant. In reality, Cordova wasn't the informant but was scared and wanted to protect himself and his family. In a bloody scene, David kills Cordova and his family. Afterward, Miguel arrives and tells Jorge that he is now the cartel's sole head of security, and he asks him to take his responsibilities very seriously in the coming period. Jorge is horrified after seeing Cordova and his family's bodies and decides that he can no longer work with the cartel, as they could kill him and his family at any moment. After making this decision, Jorge goes to a phone booth and calls Dan and Chris, informing them that he wants to cooperate with them. The next day, Jorge meets Dan and Chris at a safe location on the city's outskirts and tells them that he wants to testify against the Cali cartel, but in return, he demands protection for himself and his family and that they be relocated to the United States. Dan and Chris tell him that he must hand over one of the cartel leaders, such as Miguel, to secure full immunity. After this meeting, Jorge returns to the city and continues his work with the cartel. He meets with his men and gives them the necessary instructions, as there is a major festival expected in the city, which means the situation could become chaotic. Jorge then talks to David, Miguel's son, who informs him that he has become his father's personal bodyguard and that even Jorge doesn't know where Miguel is, making it even harder for Jorge to locate him. At that moment, Nicholas, Gilberto's son, arrives and tells his uncle Miguel about the new deal his father, Gilberto, made with the government. He also informs them that the police now know Palomari well, so they need to eliminate him quickly. After some thought, Miguel decides not to kill Palomari but to move him to a safe location. Nicholas agrees with this plan and leaves. David then talks to Miguel, asking him to attend the festival being held that day, believing that his presence will help bolster his image as the new leader. Miguel agrees with the idea and tells David to inform Jorge to ensure the place is secure. Jorge organizes all the security arrangements and then heads to a phone booth, where he calls Chris and Dan, telling them that Miguel will be at the casino tonight, giving them the opportunity to come and arrest him. At that moment, both Chris and Dan begin to feel uneasy and suspicious of Jorge, as mentioned before. They decide not to attempt to arrest Miguel that night but instead go to the casino to observe the situation and confirm Jorge's information. At the same time, we see Henao sitting with Claudio's mother and brothers, while communicating with Carrillo in Mexico. Henao agrees with Carrillo that once the Cali cartel falls, he will continue working with him. In return, Henao wants Carrillo to hand over Pacho so he can take revenge for Claudio's death. Carrillo agrees to this request and decides to hand over Pacho. That night, Pacho and his brother Alvaro are at one of Carrillo's villas when suddenly Henao's men attack them and open fire. A huge chaos breaks out in the villa, with many of Pacho's men being killed and his brother Alvaro getting injured. However, thanks to his experience, Pacho manages to kill all of Henao's men, then takes his injured brother and escapes to the United States by plane. On the other side, Miguel arrives at the casino where the festivities are taking place, and everything seems normal. During the event, Jorge notices the presence of Chris and some armed men. Jorge starts to feel suspicious and believes that these men came to arrest Miguel. He heads to the bathroom to speak with Chris and asks him about his plan to arrest Miguel. However, Chris seems surprised and tells him that he didn't come to arrest Miguel but only to verify the accuracy of Jorge's information. At that moment, Jorge realizes that the armed men are not with Chris but with Henao's cartel, and they came to seek revenge on Miguel. Quickly, Jorge tries to get Miguel out of the casino, but the gunfire starts before they can leave. Despite the chaos, Jorge manages to get Miguel out safely, and they take him home. At home, Miguel thanks Jorge for saving him and officially appoints him as head of security instead of David, giving Jorge more power and allowing him to always know Miguel's location. Afterward, Jorge goes to Chris and Dan and hands them a paper listing the places Miguel is expected to frequent in the coming days. Chris and Dan ask Jorge about the fate of Cordova, the former head of security. Jorge explains that the cartel killed Cordova and his family and that he wants to ally with them before he and his family are killed too. Although he doesn't tell them everything, Chris and Dan begin to trust him gradually and decide to cooperate with him. Then, we leave Colombia and move to the United States. There, we see the Dominican cartel's lab, which Chepe had previously taken control of, experience a massive explosion due to a mistake made by one of the workers. Later, we see Chepe sitting with his wife, and it seems he has no intention of leaving the United States, since everyone believes the lab belongs to the Dominican cartel and is not connected to the Cali cartel. However, Chepe's opinion completely changes when he sees a news report on TV linking the lab to the Cali cartel. Furious, Chepe decides to head to the restaurant where the journalist who published the story is sitting and kills him, then flies to Colombia. In the Caribbean, we see Javier arriving and meeting with the local police. He strikes a deal with them to arrest Franklin. Indeed, Javier and the police set out to search for Franklin and find him at a restaurant. Franklin tries to flee, but Javier chases him down and successfully apprehends him. Later, we see Javier with Franklin on a plane as they head back to Colombia. They agree that Franklin will confess everything in exchange for protection for his wife, Cristina. Meanwhile, we see Cristina in a beauty salon buying drugs, as she is addicted. After leaving the salon, she returns home but notices officers in front of her house, prompting her to flee immediately, thinking they came to arrest her. She tries to call Franklin in the Caribbean but cannot reach him, so she resorts to calling Javier to understand what's happening. Javier tells her that the officers she saw at her home were there to protect her and asks her to come to the United States Embassy immediately for her safety. Cristina agrees and begins heading to the embassy with the help of the drug dealer she was buying from. Suddenly, Navagente appears and kills the drug dealer, shocking Cristina. At the United States Embassy, Starkman, the lawyer, meets with Javier and talks with him briefly before informing him that Cristina has not arrived at the embassy and is not in a safe place as Javier had promised Franklin, which leads to the deal being cancelled. Javier becomes concerned because he now has no witness to convict Gilberto, meaning Gilberto could easily be released from prison. We switch to Gilberto, who contacts Miguel and tells him that Henao and his cartel attempted to kill him and Pacho. He informs Miguel that he is preparing to go to war against Henao's cartel to eliminate them. However, Gilberto disapproves of this decision and urges Miguel to wait until the deal with the government is finalized. Miguel agrees with Gilberto but, in reality, has no intention of following this request. This becomes evident when we see Miguel meeting with Pacho and Chepe after they return to the United States, informing them that he has decided to go to war against Henau's cartel. Everyone agrees with the decision, and the next day, Miguel starts his war. We see a group of Henau's men in a church listening to a sermon from the priest when they suddenly hear gunfire outside the church. Some men go outside to investigate, only to be ambushed and killed. Shortly after, Pacho storms the church and tells the congregation that they must hand over Claudio's mother and her sons, or the city will face daily bombings and killings. Pacho leaves the church, leaving everyone in shock. Now, we are introduced to Henau's cartel, known as the Northern Valley Cartel, which controls the border town of Northern Valley. This town contains a port that is one of the most critical hubs for drug trafficking, distributing narcotics worldwide. Additionally, money flows from various places into this port. In other words, whoever controls this port controls the drug trade in Colombia and possibly the entire world. The Northern Valley Cartel leaders are 4 individuals, including Claudio's mother and Henao, who is the cartel's main leader. After learning about the importance of the Northern Valley Cartel, we return to Miguel, Pacho, and Chepe, who gather and decide that they must defeat Henao's cartel and take control of the port, which serves as the cartel's main hub for its operations. Everyone agrees on Miguel's plan, and they begin strategizing how to execute it. At this point, Jorge meets with Chris and Dan and informs them that Miguel has moved to a different house from the one he was hiding in previously. Jorge also tells them that he doesn't know the details of this house very well and isn't sure if Miguel has built any secret hideouts there. Jorge assures them that he will be near the house and will remain there until the police arrive. He emphasizes that, as the head of security for the cartel, he is supposed to warn Miguel if the police approach, but now that he's cooperating with them, they can carry out the plan without Miguel being alerted. Chris and Dan agree to Jorge's plan. Later, Javier and Ambassador Arthur meet with the Minister of Defense and request that he form a special forces unit to arrest Miguel. The minister agrees, and Javier goes to meet General Serrano, a highly respected and patriotic officer. Javier asks Serrano to lead the operation, as they need a trustworthy team that isn't compromised by cartel corruption. Serrano agrees, and Javier and his team begin planning the operation step by step. Everyone agrees to move in by helicopter, with Javier accompanying a force led by Serrano's men, while another team led by Chris and Dan arrives by car. Jorge will be near the house to guide them to Miguel and ensure they arrest him before he can receive any warning. After finalizing the plan, Jorge goes home to inform his wife of what's about to happen. To his surprise, he finds his wife packing their bags and taking the kids, as she no longer feels safe. Jorge tries to convince her to stay until he finishes his mission so they can escape together, and she agrees to wait. Jorge heads to the area near Miguel's house, where he meets one of his men, Enrique, who had been guarding the place. Jorge tells Enrique that he'll take over the night's guard duty, and Enrique leaves. Before he goes, Jorge receives a call from Miguel, who asks him to come to the house immediately. Jorge feels frustrated but complies and heads to Miguel's house. Upon arrival, Miguel asks him to monitor Gilberto's phone in prison, as he's starting to lose trust in him. Jorge tries to leave to return to his post, but Miguel insists that he stay for dinner. Reluctantly, Jorge agrees. While they're having dinner, Jorge notices that Felito, Miguel's personal assistant, is carrying a walkie-talkie, meaning that if Enrique spots the police, he will notify them immediately. Jorge becomes worried and decides to disable the walkie-talkie. He asks Miguel to fetch something for him and quickly disables Felito's walkie-talkie without anyone noticing. At that moment, the police pass by Enrique, and he tries to alert Miguel, but no one responds. Meanwhile, in Miguel's house, they hear the sound of a helicopter approaching, and Miguel realizes the police are coming. He asks Jorge to go outside and see what's going on, but Jorge tries to stay with him to learn his plan. Miguel insists, and Jorge leaves, meeting the police outside while Miguel hides inside the house. A few moments later, Javier, Chris, Dan, and the special forces arrive at the house and begin searching, but they can't find Miguel. Finally, they notice that the bathroom wall seems strange and realize that Miguel is hiding behind it. Indeed, Miguel is hiding in a small space behind the wall, wearing an oxygen mask since there's no air in the space. The officers begin demolishing the wall to reach Miguel. Meanwhile, David receives word of the raid and rushes to the Deputy Attorney General, a corrupt official who receives money from the cartel. David takes the Deputy Attorney General from the golf course where he was practicing and forces him to go stop the operation. The Deputy Attorney General arrives at Miguel's house and halts the officers, claiming they don't have an official warrant to arrest Miguel. Everyone stops and leaves the house, extremely frustrated. Miguel emerges from his hideout, but is deeply shaken by the incident. His paranoia grows, especially after receiving a call from Gilberto in prison, urging him to surrender. Miguel vehemently refuses, telling Gilberto that he will never surrender. Miguel proves he is serious about his decision, as we see Pacho, Chepe, and their men attack the Northern Valley Cartel's port and completely seize control of it. At the same time, Jorge contacts Chris and asks him to help him and his family escape the city to the United States. As promised, fearing that Miguel will discover his betrayal and kill him. However, Chris informs him that the mission failed, and thus their deal is off, leaving Jorge furious. Jorge returns home to find that his wife and children have left and gone to her father's house. Jorge isn't too concerned about this and begins preparing his gun, which he hasn't used in years. Despite being the head of security for the cartel, Jorge has never killed anyone and hasn't used his gun, but it seems he is now ready to change his principles. After everything that happened, we turn to Cristina, where we discover that Navagente has kidnapped her and handed her over to an armed group. This group is a communist insurgency working with the Cali cartel, hiding anyone the cartel wants to disappear in the jungle where they reside. This detail will become important in the events to come. The next day, Javier meets with the Colombian Minister of Defense, who informs him that his mission has failed and that the Americans will not be allowed to conduct any more operations. However, Javier tells the minister that he retrieved a notebook from Miguel's house, containing all the financial records of the Cali cartel and everyone receiving bribes from them. The only problem is that the notebook is encrypted, and the only people who can decode it are the cartel leaders, accountant Palomari, or Franklin, who is currently imprisoned in the United States. Javier explains to the minister that Franklin has not cooperated yet, but he will soon once they contact his wife, Cristina. The minister agrees to let Javier continue his mission, and Javier goes to meet Berna, who has become the top drug dealer in Medellin, the city that was once under Pablo Escobar's control. Berna tells Javier that he knows where Cristina is, she's with the insurgents in the jungle. He offers his help, along with Carlos and Fidel, on the condition that Javier informs them of any future American moves against them. Javier agrees, even though it's illegal, and they begin planning how to free Cristina. Meanwhile, Gilberto discovers that Franklin has been captured. Gilberto calls his brother Miguel and asks him to get rid of Franklin, as well as Palomari, because they can decode the notebook, which could lead to disaster. But Miguel dismisses Gilberto's concerns, forcing Gilberto to assign the task to his son, Nicholas. Javier and his men head to the jungle where Cristina is being held and finally manage to free her. At the same time, we see Franklin in his United States prison, where he is attacked by a fellow inmate associated with the Cali cartel and killed in cold blood. News of Franklin's murder reaches Javier, who is shocked, realizing that all hope of decoding the notebook has vanished. Meanwhile, Nicholas receives a call from the hitman who carried out Franklin's assassination. We see that Nicholas, reluctantly, is getting deeper into his family's dirty business. We return to Miguel, who is sitting with his son David and some cartel members. During this meeting, Miguel and David are informed that there is a traitor within the cartel, and everyone suspects that the traitor is Enrique, as he was at the security post and didn't report the police presence. David contacts Jorge and asks him to come with Enrique, which makes Jorge realize that Enrique is in danger. Instead of putting Enrique at risk, Jorge takes him to a safe place to hide. Then, Jorge goes to meet Miguel and David and tells them he doesn't know where Enrique is. However, David begins to hint that Jorge himself might be the traitor. David then takes Jorge to Enrique's mother's house to check if he's there. Before Jorge gets out of the car, he leaves a recorder on, recording David's conversation with his friend. Afterward, we see that Miguel receives a set of recorded tapes, which contain conversations between his brother Gilberto and others. From these tapes, it becomes clear that Gilberto was trying to convince Pacho and Chepe to surrender. After listening to the recordings, Miguel decides to take action. Meanwhile, a refrigerator full of the bodies of Hanao's men, who had been watching Miguel in Cali, is delivered to Hanao. Hanao realizes that Miguel killed them and finds a note with the bodies that reads, "Contact me." Hanao decides to reach out to Miguel, but the details of their communication are not shown. Later, Miguel meets with Pacho and Chepe and tells them that he heard their conversations with Gilberto and knows they were considering surrender. Miguel offers them a better deal. Chepe can return to New York and continue working as he was, while Miguel tells Pacho that he has made a deal with Hanao to end their conflict in exchange for handing over Claudio's family for revenge. Miguel gives Pacho the location of Claudio's family, and Pacho is thrilled. Both Pacho and Chepe agree to rejoin Miguel and reject Gilberto's surrender plan. At the same time, Javier meets with Ambassador Arthur and informs him that someone within the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, or the Colombian government is leaking information to the Cali cartel. Javier suspects that the Minister of Defense is the corrupt official. However, Ambassador Arthur refuses to believe this and tells Javier that he must arrest Miguel today, or he won't be able to continue the investigation. Javier seizes the opportunity and heads to Chris and Dan, asking them to prepare a task force to arrest Miguel. He then goes to General Serrano and asks him to personally lead the operation. Serrano, Chris, Dan, and Jorge develop a detailed plan to arrest Miguel. The plan involves Jorge luring Miguel out of the house so they can arrest him on the road. Everyone agrees on the plan. Meanwhile, Javier wants to confirm the corruption of the Minister of Defense, so he goes to him and tells him that Miguel will be at a specific location. At this moment, the minister becomes visibly nervous, and Javier realizes that the minister is indeed corrupt. On the other hand, Jorge goes to Miguel and tells him he needs to leave the house immediately because the police are coming. But shortly after, Miguel receives a call informing him that the police are already on their way. Miguel realizes that the Minister of Defense leaked the information. Jorge contacts Chris, who, along with his men, had surrounded the house, and tells him that Miguel is preparing to flee. At this point, we see that David, Miguel's son, has been tracking Jorge's movements and discovers that he has been frequenting the same location where he was meeting with Chris and Dan. David becomes convinced that Jorge is the traitor. David calls his father Miguel and informs him of his discovery. Miguel then begins torturing Jorge to force him to confess to his betrayal. At that moment, Chris realizes that Jorge has been inside the house too long and hasn't come out, so he decides to storm the house with his team. They kill all of Miguel's men, just as Miguel is about to kill Jorge. Miguel escapes with one of his men through a secret elevator, but they leave one of the cartel members to guard Jorge. Fortunately, Chris arrives at the last moment and saves Jorge by killing the guard. Meanwhile, Miguel flees in a car, but General Serrano chases him down and eventually captures him. On the other hand, David heads to exact revenge on Jorge's wife and children, but Dan has been watching over them to protect them. When David arrives at the house, he gets into a shootout with Dan and is forced to flee. Afterward, Dan takes Jorge's family to a safe location. In the end, Miguel is arrested and placed in prison. His brother Gilberto visits him in prison and tells him that he's not angry with him and that he will stay by his side until they both get out soon. Everyone wonders how Gilberto can be so confident that they'll be released quickly. The answer becomes clear when journalist Carolina meets with Javier and tells him that she has discovered that Medina, the person who negotiated with Gilberto, has close ties to Colombian President Ernesto and the Minister of Defense and is receiving money from them to protect the Cali cartel. Carolina realizes that the President and the Minister of Defense will help the cartel leaders get out of prison without any consequences. Javier goes to Ambassador Arthur and informs him of what Carolina discovered. The ambassador surprises him by saying that the United States government already knows this but cannot act because President Ernesto is an ally of the United States. Javier becomes extremely frustrated by the rampant corruption. A few days later, Pacho fulfills his promise and goes to Claudio's family's house with his men, killing them all in cold blood. Afterward, Pacho decides to surrender, and Chepe follows suit. Both join Gilberto and Miguel in prison. At the same time, the Colombian president uses the situation to announce that he was the one who dismantled the Cali cartel, even though that's not the truth. Javier realizes that his mission isn't over yet, so he goes to Jorge, who is now living in a secret apartment in Colombia while waiting to be relocated to the United States. Javier tells Jorge that the only way to ensure the cartel leaders remain in prison is to decode the notebook they retrieved from Miguel. But no one can decode it except for Palomari. Javier asks Jorge to help him find Palomari. Jorge informs Javier that Palomari's wife has a close associate named Freddy, and through him, they can find Palomari in the place where he's hiding. Jorge searches the house but doesn't find Enrique, so he informs David. David decides to stay and monitor the area, asking Jorge to go with Navagente on another mission. Once Jorge is in a safe place, he listens to the recording and discovers that David and his friend were talking about the presence of an informant within the Drug Enforcement Agency. David suspects that the informant might be Jorge. Jorge then goes with Navagente to Palomari's house to kill him, but they discover that Palomari has fled with his family. Palomari was clever enough to realize that the cartel would kill him once they discovered the notebook, so he escaped with his family. After this failed mission, Jorge receives a call from David, telling him they've found Enrique. Jorge rushes to the location, where he finds Enrique brutally tortured, with Miguel and David present. At this moment, David accuses Jorge of knowing about the presence of drug enforcement officers in the city and failing to report it to the cartel. They also claim that Enrique has confessed to being the traitor. They decide to kill Enrique, but before they do, a pager goes off in Enrique's pocket. It turns out to be a satellite pager given to informants by the American authorities. Jorge tells the cartel that this proves Enrique was the informant, thereby clearing himself of suspicion. Miguel and David quickly and brutally kill Enrique. In reality, it was Jorge who placed the pager in Enrique's pocket to save himself and his family. Despite feeling guilty, Jorge had no choice but to do it to protect himself. After the incident, Jorge contacts Dan and tells him that he knows where Miguel is and wants to help them arrest him. However, they must act quickly because Miguel has become increasingly unstable and dangerous and could kill anyone at any moment. After that, Javier wastes no time and goes directly to Freddy, telling him he needs his help to capture Palomari, promising him a large sum of money in return. Javier leaves after planning a listening device and learns that Freddy contacts Palomari's wife, asking her to turn in her husband to the United States authorities for the money. Palomari's wife doesn't make an immediate decision and prefers to think about it, but for Javier and Jorge, the wiretap was enough to determine Palomari's location. They decide to move in to arrest him. At the same time, Miguel calls his son David and orders him to kill Palomari. Miguel knows that if the United States authorities reach Palomari first and he agrees to cooperate with them by decoding the notebook, they will all be in danger. David reluctantly agrees and sends Navagente to assassinate Palomari once his location is known. Later, we see David at a casino he runs, where Maria, Miguel's wife, arrives to ask him for money and a place to live with her son. David has ignored them ever since Miguel was imprisoned. David refuses to help her and asks her to leave. In a moment of anger, Maria decides to get revenge on David, just as she betrayed Claudio before. She contacts Hanau and offers to reveal David's location in exchange for protection for herself and her son. Hanau agrees. On the same day, Freddy arrives at David's place, offering to hand over Palomari, hoping to get money from both sides. Instead, David tortures him to extract information about Palomari's whereabouts. Once David has the information, he sends Navagente to kill Palomari. Meanwhile, Javier, Chris, and Dan arrive at Palomari's house and begin negotiating with him, trying to convince him to surrender. They offer protection for his family and safe passage to the United States, in exchange for his help in decoding the notebook. After much thought, Palomari agrees to their terms. Outside, Jorge is securing the area, when Navagente suddenly appears and realizes that Jorge has betrayed the cartel. Despite his anger, Navagente decides not to kill Jorge immediately and plans to take him to David after finishing off Javier and Palomari. However, Jorge doesn't wait and pulls out his gun, killing Navagente on the spot. Afterward, Jorge, Javier, and the rest escape the area and head to the airport to transport Palomari to the United States. Meanwhile, David receives news of what happened and rushes to the airport, but before he can get there, he is ambushed by Hanau's men and killed. Thus, David's story comes to a tragic end. In the following days, Palomari is tried in the United States and confesses everything, including the involvement of President Ernesto and the Minister of Defense in collaborating with the Cali cartel. This confession causes a significant upheaval in Colombia, prompting President Ernesto to go on national television and deny the accusations. Meanwhile, the United States ambassador informs Javier that neither the president nor the Minister of Defense will face punishment, but at least Gilberto and the other cartel leaders will not be released from prison. However, this solution does not satisfy Javier, who decides to take matters into his own hands. He invites journalist Carolina for an interview, where he reveals all the facts, including the President and Minister of Defense's involvement with the cartel. He also mentions that the United States government is turning a blind eye to the situation because Ernesto is an ally. These statements cause a massive media uproar in Colombia, leading President Ernesto to announce that none of the cartel leaders will be released. Despite this, Chepe manages to use his connections to escape from prison. After his escape, he contacts Carlos and Fidel, asking them to collaborate with him to rebuild the Cali cartel's empire. However, Carlos and Fidel feel betrayed by the cartel and decide to exact revenge by killing Chepe and dumping his body in the street. In prison, we see Pacho exacting revenge on a member of Hanau's cartel by killing him in retaliation for the murder of Claudio and his family. Finally, Gilberto and Miguel are extradited to the United States, where they spend the rest of their lives in prison. As for Jorge, after the case is over, the United States government decides to prosecute him for his involvement with the Cali cartel. He is forced to admit his guilt and is entered into the United States witness protection program, where he disappears entirely. In Colombia, Jorge becomes a pariah, known as a rat, and if he ever considers returning to his country, he will be killed immediately. At last, after everything that has happened, Javier goes to meet Ambassador Arthur and tells him that he has decided to retire after successfully taking down the two largest drug trafficking organizations in the world, Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel. In the final scene, we see Javier returning to his father's ranch, where he sits quietly with him, bringing this epic series, which is based on true events that happened in the real world, to a close. If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.